What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic, and one of the most interesting names in the history of the Colombo crime family is Wild Bill Cutolo. Let's be frank, Cutolo was an absolute powerhouse, and in the end, he went missing due to the fact that people thought he was becoming too powerful. We have talked about Cutolo. We've even interviewed his son, which can be seen here. Today, though, we're going to get into another individual, a man who would call Cutolo his mentor, and a guy that down the road would become one of Cutolo's chief bodyguards. The story of the forgotten Joe Campy Campanella. Next on the Sit Down. Joseph Campanella was born in and around 1960 in Brooklyn, New York. I say in and around due to the fact that even though I do pretty deep research, I was unable to find Joe Campanella's exact birthday. But my belief is he was born in 1960. Campanella would grow up on 11th Avenue in Brooklyn. Now, if you know anything about this area of Brooklyn, it has for years been a haven for the mafia, most notably groups like the Colombo Crime Family. Now, growing up, Campanella, who had a brother called Frank, would say that he would commit petty crimes, selling weed, robbing vehicles, and eventually would meet a guy called Robert D'Onofrio. He'd meet him as a child, and they would be friends throughout their life. D'Onofrio today is allegedly the head of the current Colombo crime family. He would also say that at around 7 or 8 years old, he would meet a person called Vincent Chicky DiMartino, who would become close friends with Campanella until really the end, which we'll get into, and it would be the change in both their lives. Campanella, as a teen, he would say that around 1976, he would be arrested for assault. Now, as far as I know, the case involving Campanella for assault was he's, knifed up a black teenager who, according to what we know, was hassling girls in the neighborhood. Though for Campanella, he got lucky as the case would eventually be dropped. Campanella would graduate from high school in 1978 from New Utrecht High School, which is in Brooklyn. Now, at the age of 17, Campanella, though, would face very sad news. His father would pass away from a heart attack when he was just 17 years old. And this really would be the changing part in his life. Look, I lost my father, but I lost him when I was 34 years old. For Campanella, he was 17. He was at the time of his life where it was most important to have his father. By that point, though, he had delved into the streets, and guess what? The mob was waiting for him, and ultimately certain people in the mob became his quasi-father figure. Campanella would say many years later that if it wasn't for his father's death, he likely would not have continued to pursue a life in organized crime into his 20s, but the people around him at the time were mobsters. Now, around his graduation from high school and into his late teens, Campanella would become affiliated with a person called Bill Cutolo. By that point, Cutolo was connected with Robert D'Onofrio, and through Robert D'Onofrio, Campanella became an associate of Bill Cutolo. He would say that Cutolo would teach him how to be a loan shark, and by that point, Cutolo is one of the biggest loan sharks in Brooklyn, and that Campanella began collecting loan proceeds on behalf of Cutolo. And eventually, Cutolo would give him money to put on the street as well, where he would charge up to 5 points. Now, eventually into the 80s, Campanella would delve into other rackets, including extortion. And he would say by the mid-80s, he began shaking down Russians who were running illegal medical businesses. Now, if you know anything about Brighton Beach, areas where Russians emigrated to, they would have their own medical facilities. And a lot of this stuff was illegal. The medical care was illegal. Some of the prescriptions were illegal. They were cash cows and they needed protection. The Colombo crime family, various crime families would shake them down. And Campanella would say he would make approximately $250 to $500 per business to have protection for them. So he was making his presence felt in that. And down the road, Campanella would create his own medical supply company called Savannah, which would operate on 17th Avenue. So that was something he would make money with throughout his life. In December of 1989, Campanella would receive a phone call instructing him to get ready, essentially. He would believe that that night he would become a made member of the Colombo crime family. Campanella would say that his sponsor, Cutolo, would contact him and they would go to a home in Long Island. Proceeding over his ceremony were Wild Bill Cutolo and Little Vic Arena. Now, Campanella would talk about the ceremony saying, quote, Cutolo told me he's going to pass my name around and most likely he wouldn't see a problem. About a week and a half later, he got back to me and told me my name went to the family and to other families and that there's going to be a ceremony. I had met Little Rob and Joe Legrano. We had met in the neighborhood and then we drove to Bill Cutolo's house. And from there, we went to Long Island. Cutolo told me to go to the basement to wait till my name was called. They then called me up. I went upstairs. Bill had just pinched my trigger finger with a knife, made some blood come out. He put a saint in my hand, burned it, and just repeated a couple of words after what he said in Italian. That was it. You basically confess yourself to the family. Also made that night alongside Campanella were Joseph Boranza, as well as Pasquale Fat Patty Catalano. And Catalano would operate out of Middle Village, Queens, and was one of the only people based in Queens for the Colombo crime family. Now, for Campanella, understand he is not even 30 years old at this point, so things were good for the young Campanella. Now, as we know, in 1989, this would precede the Colombo War, the Third Colombo War. At that point, as we know, the Arena faction and the Persco faction would turn Brooklyn into a shooting gallery. And for Campanella, he would obviously side with Bill Cutolo, who would side with Little Vic Arena. Now, Campanella would say that during the war, things would ratchet up quickly, and he would act as one of the main bodyguards for Wild Bill Cutolo. Also inside Cutolo's inner circle at that point were Vincent Chicky DiMartino, Michael Spataro, and Dominic Black Dom Dionisio. Now, others protected him as well, and it was said that during the Colombo War, if Cutolo would go anywhere, he would travel with up to 15 people. And we'll talk about one of those instances where someone tried to shoot at Bill Cutolo with 15 people around him. That was the out there-ness of the Colombo War and the third version of it. Now, Campanella would say that during the war, he, quote, just followed orders and did exactly what he was told to do. Now, he was involved in 3 different murder conspiracies against people connected to the Persco faction, including one of Greg the Grim Reaper Scarpa. At one point, Campanella would say of Scarpa, we had information that some of Greg's guys would be driving down a particular block in Brooklyn, and our plan was to shoot into their cars. He would say it also, quote, wasn't a personal vendetta, but rather a directive that they were following. He would also say in 1991 that after the failed hit on Greg Scarpa, which various people in that faction were a part of, he would say that at one point in 1991, Wild Bill Cutolo decided to go out and get a haircut in the area of 86th Street and 21st Avenue, and that 15 guys were taking him to get that haircut. A person called Ronald Calvo was almost whacked after he shot at Bill Cutolo. Campanella would say that he, quote, fired shots back at him, but he lived. So, various murder plots either happened or didn't happen. Some Campanella was directly involved with, and some that he wasn't. Now, we have to remember that one of the main shooters for Cutolo and for the Arena faction at the time were Cutolo himself, as well as Vincent Chicky DiMartino. Now, Campanella would state that the war essentially stopped after a ceasefire was called in 1993, and because everyone was getting indictment and some were whacked. Now, he would say, Campanella, that once the ceasefire happened, the Arena faction was acting on a, quote, committee basis, and that Bill was at the top of it. However, the problem for Campanella was eventually Bill Cutolo and some of his crew would be arrested in early 1993. Now, for them, though, Campanella was not included in this, and he was essentially made acting captain of the Cutolo crew while Cutolo was in prison. Now, Campanella would say that after Cutolo and his boys get out in 1994, they were all busted back to soldier by the Persco faction, and that multiple sit-downs would happen between everyone, inviting Bill Cutolo to, quote, reunite with the Persco crew, most notably Alley Boy Persico. Now, Campanella would state that once that would happen in 1994, Bill would gain more responsibility. He would get bigger and bigger, and the two became distant, both Campanella and Wild Bill. He would also, Campanella, say that he became annoyed due to the fact that Cutolo was making money that he wasn't a part of. Campanella states that when they were all together, all the money they made went to each other and that they shared in spoils of things all the time. He would talk about the fact that Wild Bill at one point began a stock fraud scheme with Black Dom Dionisio and that they were making, quote, millions. Campanella would say we stood together and he expected spoils from it, but Cutolo never gave him any of it and that they became a little bit more distant. But as we know, by the mid-90s, things were ratcheting up. Cutolo was getting more and more responsibility. He was becoming bigger and bigger. And he was essentially, with the two factions, he was the leader of one faction. Now, they weren't warring anymore, but a lot of people were still under the Arena side of things. And I think the Persco group, as we know, they were drunk with power. They start recognizing that Cutolo is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. He's getting more and more power. We eventually know what happened. Now, around this time, Campanella has his own issue with his old pal, Vincent Chicky DiMartino. Around this time, DiMartino accuses Campanella of, while he's in prison in the late 80s, of sleeping with DiMartino's wife. Now, this issue became such a problem, DiMartino would go to Wild Bill Cutolo to have Campanella whacked. However, Cutolo says, no, that's not going to happen. And the situation just kind of deads itself. Now, I want to get into what would ultimately happen, because as we know, Wild Bill Cutolo would go missing in May of 1999. And about 6 weeks, according to Campanella, before Mr. Cutolo disappears, he would state that he was at a sit-down for a different matter involving two families. And he was approached in the street by Jackie DeRoss, who at the time was on the kind of panel, if you will, of the Colombo Crime Family. He was very connected to Alley Boy Persico. He was then said, according to Campanella, that they wanted to get rid of Cutolo, and he asked him Campanella's opinion on it. Campanella claims he was shocked at this and that he just kind of bowed his head and didn't pay it much mind. He was kind of blown away, and he thought maybe DeRoss was just bluffing, whatever. And remember, Campanella was very close to Cutolo throughout their life, so he kind of didn't think much of it. 6 weeks later, Wild Bill Cutolo would disappear. Now, Campanella said that he knew something was up when, a day or two later, Cutolo would always come to their social club in Brooklyn on Wednesday nights, and that they were there. There's about 15 people there, and Cutolo didn't show, and he knew something was wrong. The next day, he would go to the home of Bill Cutolo to comfort Peggy, Bill's wife, Bill Jr., and that's when they kind of knew the writing was on the wall. Campanella would state when he learned of what happened to Cutolo, he was, quote, sick and devastated learning of it. Now, he would eventually speak to DeRoss, and DeRoss would state to him, quote, he would ask him, and then I asked him what else was going on. Jackie told me that the situation with Bill, that Bill had to go. He was getting too powerful. And that if and when Alley Boy went away on a gun charge, Bill would have taken over the family and he would never give the family back to Alley Boy. And that was the reason Bill had to go. He was too powerful. He also said that Jackie was offended that Bill had gotten too much going on and that he was making too much money. He was also offended that, quote, Bill's girlfriend had a bigger house than he did. So we could also assess that not only was he too powerful, Bill Cutolo, but that he was making so much money that even his Gumata had a bigger home than some of the members at the top of the Colombo Crime Family. They were just jealous, really. So Cutolo he was very powerful and he was viewed as a threat. And they believed that if Cutolo got control of the family as acting, underboss or acting boss, that he would take the family over completely. So they whacked him out. Campanella essentially got right back into line and just continued to operate. That was the world of the mafia. By 2001, he was still very involved in extortion, loan sharking, and medical fraud. As I said, he had a medical supply company called Savannah on 17th Avenue in and around Bensonhurst. By 2001, though, again, Chicky DiMartino decides, at this whole point, there's over 6-7 years, he wants Joe Campanella killed. Cutolo's out of the way. The family's kind of messy at this point. And DiMartino views this as, this is my shot to get rid of my old nemesis. Remember, these guys had known each other since they were little boys. And Campanella would state that on July 16th, 2001, he would be in Coney Island, where he would be walking on the street, and he viewed a green van coming towards him. He would recognize the two people in the van were Chicky DiMartino and another member of the Colombo Crime Family, John the Barber Floridia. He would say that they would start shooting at him where he'd be hit twice. However, he would obviously not die. Now, the government would come to him subsequent to the shooting when he was in the hospital. However, he would tell the government he had no idea who shot him. So Campanella was still dug in. He was not facing any charges, and he would tell the government, I don't know who shot me. However, though, weeks later, he then approached the U.S. government. Remember, he was not charged or arrested for anything. Now, I learned something very interesting about why Campanella would cooperate. I spoke directly to Mikey Scars, who down the road in the 2000s was a cellmate with Campanella, once they both cooperated. According to Mikey Scars, he would tell me that Campanella told him directly that one of the things that led, obviously, to his cooperation was obviously the fact that the Colombo Crime Family tried to kill him and that, he was just done with the life. But he, at that point, was so disenchanted that he read the paper one day and saw Mikey Scars had cooperated, and he thought, wow, if he can do it, what am I doing here? Why am I still trying to hold on to this? And he kind of saw the writing on the wall, called the government. And again, down the road in November of 2002, Campanella would be arrested and hit with racketeering, loan sharking, extortion, and fraud charges. In the end, he would be very detrimental to the top levels of the Colombo Crime Family. He would testify against his old friend, Chicky DiMartino. And DiMartino would eventually be convicted and given 25 years in federal prison. He would also testify against John Floridia. And he would also speak against Jackie DeRoss and Ali Boy Persico. Understand that both DeRoss and Persico are serving life in prison. They will die there. And a lot of that had to do with some of the testimony that came from Joseph Campanella. Campanella would ultimately receive about 3 years in prison, and in 2008, he would be completely free. As I said, during his time in prison, he would serve several years and be a cellmate with Mikey Scars DiLeonardo. Mikey Scars would tell me that he really liked Campanella and that he was about as normal of a member of the mob as it gets. He followed orders, he did what he was told, and he was always a good guy to him. Upon his release from prison, it has been said, according to Campanella, he would speak to the Village Voice and say that he had declined witness protection. He would also tell the Village Voice in that same article, quote, "Right now, I love being a regular guy. You enjoy life completely different. You see life as it's supposed to be. The best part is your phone doesn't ring and you're not getting told where to go and that, quote, you got to come meet me and you got to answer right away or else." Now, at one point, Campanella lived right in the neighborhood that he had cooperated against the folks that lived in that neighborhood. Eventually, Campanella, from what I understand, moved out of New York and lives somewhere in America currently. He is in his 60s and at one point got into some sort of ministry work with a person called Glenn Hovater, alongside another associate of the mob, a person called Bill Cutolo Jr. They would create a group called the Godfellas, which was some sort of ministry work. Again, Campanella, though, has been pretty quiet since around 2012. I don't know where he currently lives, and I've never spoken to him. I will say this. If, Joe Campanella, you watch this video and you'd like to get in contact with me and speak to me, my email is in the description. I'd love to hear from you. Campanella is a really interesting guy, and in the end, he's largely forgotten in terms of mobsters and mob informants. Campanella grit his teeth in the streets of Brooklyn, was active during the Colombo War, and even participated in some of the biggest murder conspiracies. He would put various members, high-ranking members of the family away for life, and was supremely close with Wild Bill Cutolo. A very interesting story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know what you think of it in the comments below. We'll see you next week here on The Sitdown.